Hello, welcome. This is the audio-only podcast for the Martial Arts Yoga Academy. Tentatively going to be called the Maya Philosophy Podcast or channel or something along those lines. So, thanks for being here. I assume that probably the first question that anybody's going to have about something that calls itself Martial Arts Yoga Academy is, what is martial arts yoga? It's my intention to spend some time, longer than I can devote to a single podcast or a short conversation, exploring that topic. It's my intention to explore that topic over a series of recordings. But I guess you have to start somewhere. The sutras, the Yoga Sutras, instruct the practitioner right out of the gate that the practice of yoga begins now, right? Basically, you start where you are. I like to start unpacking this question of what is martial arts yoga by beginning actually with the second half of that, the yoga part. Because I think all of this will make a little more sense that way. Yoga is a very big topic to try and unpack, and doing so is especially fraught with peril for, people like me. Your standard issue American Jewish guy. A guy like me trying to get on some sort of a high horse about what yoga is or is not is a dubious proposition. So I'm going to try to avoid doing that. Instead, I'll be using this space right now to talk about yoga as a framework that I've adopted in my life. I will tell you how I understand it, where I've drawn inspiration from, and where I go to seek guidance and instruction. And I'm hoping that some of that personal perspective will be more broadly applicable or relevant to other people as well. That's my hope. It might not be. If it's not, I certainly invite you to share your own contrasting perspectives, because I think there's a lot of value in putting different perspectives in contrast with one another. All right, what is yoga? Here's somewhere you could start. You ask one of these increasingly concerning, artificially intelligent chat monsters, what is yoga? So you go to, ChatGPT, what is yoga? And it tells me that yoga is a holistic practice originating from ancient India that combines physical postures, known as asana, with breath control, known as pranayama, in addition to meditation and ethical principles which promote physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. It encompasses various styles and approaches aiming to cultivate harmony between the mind, the body, and the spirit. Well, that's a pretty good answer, huh? I mean, it's pretty hard to compete with that. If we felt compelled to nudge at that answer a little, maybe we could try to unpack some of the concepts that were sort of baked in it, right? Because if you want to still get a little deep on some philosophical exercises that the robots haven't quite cracked just yet, the way to do that is usually to play the what does that mean game until you can't get a good answer anymore. So here's a term that popped up in there, right? Holistic practice. What's that all about? Because if yoga is a holistic practice originating from ancient India, maybe it's worth figuring out what the heck a holistic practice is, right? So I ask ChatGPT again, what is a holistic practice? And it tells me a holistic practice refers to an approach that considers the whole person, body, mind, emotions, and spirit in addressing health and well-being. It emphasizes the interconnectedness of different aspects of an individual's life and aims to promote balance and harmony in all areas. Holistic practices often involve a combination of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual techniques to support overall wellness. Examples include yoga, meditation, acupuncture, and aromatherapy. Okay. We got from yoga to holistic practice and from holistic practice back to yoga. So it didn't take too long to complete that circle, did it? We also got a bunch of other deceptively complicated terms in there like spirit and wellness. A lot we could continue to unpack there, asking, what is spirit? What is wellness? Now, I'm sure if we did ask ChatGPT what is spirit, it would have a very interesting answer, but ultimately probably it's not gonna get you I think where you want to go with that question. But overall, I like the answers that we got. I think they did a pretty good job of consolidating the more nuanced responses on this question and bringing them together into a very concise statement. So here where we are beginning, what is martial arts yoga? What is yoga? What is a holistic practice? I'd like to focus on this holistic thing. I think this is the right place to start, at least, well, I think that this is a reasonable place to start. How's that? Holistic. Sounds a lot like whole, right? Holistic. That's how I understand it. You are taking the whole of a person as the object of your concern or focus. This is something that you might contrast to a reductive practice, which would try to look at a very specific element or function in a person's life. Now, if you have a kidney problem, you're going to want to go and see somebody who has gone in deep on kidneys, right? That sounded a little suggestive. It wasn't meant to be. Now, if I had used the prostate as my example and said you'll want to find someone who has gone in deep on prostates, that would have been suggestive. So it's a good thing that I didn't say that. Yoga is described to us as a holistic practice, but an immediate question to consider is where exactly are the lines between the whole and the parts, and what should be the balance between going in deep on a very specific part to study versus taking those parts and putting them back together into something larger and then saying that larger thing, that is the thing that I want to look at, right? Yoga is commonly understood as a method of the latter, of looking at the whole thing. But what I'm going to try and convince you is that it's actually a sort of meta method for moving between wholes and parts. That sounded suggestive again. We're not getting to any of the freaky stuff right now. This word yoga is often translated as a yoke, which is a sort of joint between things, a union. So there's built into this philosophy the notion of taking things that are considered separate and maybe even taken separately for very practical and important reasons, but then placing them back together as part of some greater whole. You could consider an aspect of your life or health in its individuality, and you could choose as an object of study this reduced element for purposes of deep knowledge of that element. But now you're going to, for reasons we will continue to explore, you're going to combine that thing with something else. You're going to say, I'm going to look at these things now as related to one another in some fundamental way, as part of some bigger system. And that brings us to a method or a philosophy of systems and systems analysis. Reductive practices are at the core of so much of our knowledge. They are incredibly important to us. A yoga practice does not deny that. Instead, I think it instructs us that there is something equally important about remembering to zoom out from time to time, to remember that we are integrated in a variety of complex ways with other things around us. And to remember that even our own internal sense of self, that perhaps we perceive as a singular thing, is also an integration of different systems, right? And you can get technical with that, and you can talk about your circulatory system, your nervous system, your endocrine system, your skeletal system, right? These are all systems, and they're systems that exist within systems. The relationship between your nervous system and your skeletal system, for example, mediated through your musculature. Now, you can also get a little abstract about your sense of self and think about the networks of social systems that you exist in, like your job, your family, maybe your religious community or any spiritual institutions you are a member of. The very language you speak and think with is also a social system, right? It's hard to separate our sense of identity from the language that we use to think about it with, isn't it? And so if we were to ask ourselves, how do we understand ourselves not just as reduced elements like kidneys and prostates and nervous systems, but as a whole body, or maybe a member of a society of many bodies, suddenly there's a lot to think about, isn't there? This is a daunting task, and it's not one that I personally recommend undertaking without some structure or method. And to me, that's one of the reasons why this philosophy of yoking, of union, has persisted for so long. There's enormous value in trying to guide people through the process of moving between reductive and holistic thinking. But there's also danger. There's the risk of starting to yoke things together that maybe, for whatever reason, in this particular context, were better understood in a reduced or isolated form. Our blood, for example, is vitally important to our health in a variety of ways, perhaps more ways than we currently understand scientifically. But when we start to yoke it to our health haphazardly and in a sloppy way, well, then maybe we end up with some nonsensical and harmful practices like bloodletting, right? To yoke things in a way that is genuinely beneficial and useful requires an appreciation and understanding of reductive analysis. And so therefore, it's a practiced method. It takes discipline. You don't just start slapping shit together and saying, you know what, I bet my kidney is failing because I'm not practicing gratitude enough in the morning. Gosh, look how integrated I am now. Kidneys and gratitude. That's not what's being advised, at least not in my interpretation of these practices. There may be some people out there who advise that, but I am not counted among them. There's a discipline. You have to have a method of abstracting the reduced back to the whole and moving back and forth between those frameworks in a thoughtful way. So maybe there is a relationship between the practice of gratitude and kidney dysfunction that you could draw out and find, but you don't put the cart before the horse and act like you can just replace dialysis with meditation. Maybe the meditation helps you change behaviors to be more aligned with long-term organ health, eating better, exercising more, getting your vitamins, avoiding drugs or alcohol, right? You are yoking mindfulness and organ health to one another in this more abstract sense, but you're doing it with humility. You're doing it thoughtfully, and you are paying special respect to those among us who have committed themselves to a reductive study enough to tell you something genuinely useful about the parts that should constitute the whole. That ability, to me, is deeply enmeshed within the practice of yoga. Yoga is about joining things together that should be joined together in a disciplined and practiced way. You don't have to construct this meta system of systems from scratch. You can look at how people historically have been approaching this challenge. I'll pause here to say that we are talking broadly about philosophical orientation. There is a lot one could say about the specific cultural and historical elements of the yoga tradition. Remember ChatGPT telling us this comes from ancient India, and so there are Indian cultural and historical elements that should be discussed and understood as well, and we will down the road. Something that may be encouraging to you as you begin your study of these concepts, at least was encouraging to me to think about, is that you can find elements of this way of thinking within most serious studies of anything, right? Because even if it's just saying, I'm going to focus very specifically on heart health and become a cardiologist, I'm going to be a heart health expert, and I'm going to know everything there is to know about the heart and how it functions and what it does and what makes a strong heart, a weak heart, a sick heart, a healthy heart. What are the kinds of risks to hearts? As soon as you call yourself a cardiologist, you're going to have to determine where exactly you place the boundaries around your area of expertise. This creates what is sometimes referred to in philosophical circles as a line drawing problem. The line drawing problem can be thought of as the logical corollary to the yoking problem. How you separate two things that are one versus how you unify two things that are separate. Another way of putting it is to take a metaphorical box and label it the heart. Now, what is on the inside of the box and what's on the outside? And on this question of boxes and what you put in them, yoga has a quality to it that is potentially enlightening, but also potentially maddening, which is its self-referential quality. That it's like it's a system for understanding systems. It's a practice of practice. It's a box of boxes. Why are we interested in this particular posture, this asana that we're going to say involves spinal flexion? Well, I've made a box, spinal flexion. And I'm going to try and understand what goes into this box across a variety of contexts. So inside of the box, spinal flexion could be all the different poses that constitute spinal flexion from my point of view, or from just the point of view of anatomy. That's another big box that we call anatomy, and we argue over what goes inside of it. But our spinal flexion box, what box does that sit inside of? Perhaps spinal flexion is part of a bigger box called spinal movements. And I'm going to say in that box, I put spinal flexion, spinal extension, axial extension, spinal rotation. Am I missing anything? Those are my spine movements, right? Well, what does that box sit inside of? Why are we putting those things together? Maybe our next step up is just body mechanics in general, inclusive of not just the spine, but the elbows, shoulders, hips, knees. And that's starting to be a pretty big box, isn't it? Full body movement and mechanics. There are people who take that box as already a pretty holistic practice of body analysis. People like Kelly Starrett, very well known for his Becoming a Supple Leopard textbook, a textbook I strongly recommend to anyone with even a passing interest in self-care from that kind of physiotherapist perspective. That's a useful framework, right? The physiotherapist. I think that's the proper term. It's a PT. That's a particular lens for understanding the body. Of course, Kelly Starrett may have deeply held religious principles. I have no idea. I haven't looked into that. But as best as I could tell, he doesn't talk about any of that in his textbook. There's no overt spirituality in there that I've found. So from this perspective, body mechanics are almost like a kind of engineering problem. And Mr. Starrett is looking at your body as you would look at maybe your car in the shop and trying to see, okay, how do we buff out this issue or that issue? Why is this thing leaking? That sort of thing. Is that holistic or reductive? Well, it's much more holistic than just looking at one joint or limb. But there's still larger boxes we could find to put this framework inside of. Where does body mechanics sit in this rabbit hole? What's the larger box to put that one inside of? Maybe, and this is a pretty big one, it's physical health. So mechanics become a component, but not the entirety, of a larger box called physical health. And your physical health may include things like your sleep and nutrition and your hormones, a whole variety of things that you start to add on top. So maybe the question you started with was, hey, does my shoulder move well? Then you started looking at your arm, then your spine, then your whole body, then your exercise, then your lifestyle. And before you know it, you're sunning your balls every morning. That was a joke. And jokes aside, the other aspects of physical health are often going to be independent from motion, right? They have their own complexity to them that warrants putting tinier boxes inside of them too. So nutrition becomes its own box, and you start to put a lot of things in there. And you start to have to separate those things from one another too. It's rabbit holes inside of rabbit holes inside of rabbit holes. What I'm trying to convey is that yoga offers some helpful tools for thinking about the connection points between these boxes or layers. In Sanskrit, which is the language of yoga, so to speak, this is sometimes referred to as koshas or the kosha model. A kosha is like a layer. I'm not an expert in Sanskrit, but a kosha is essentially a layer. Now, as you move through these layers, you are likely to bump into some rather challenging questions about your existence, your purpose, and ultimately your meaning. And the reason for this is that where you place things in your system of systems, how you draw lines between one layer and another, is going to be a reflection of your personal value system, what you decide is or is not important. And if you put your inner value system into this recursive system of systems analysis, weird things can start to happen. It's kind of like when a child keeps asking you why over and over until you get to some proposition you simply take as an unfalsifiable article of faith. I think we've all heard it. Many of us have caught ourselves saying it to our children at one point or another. Because I said so. Now, this is a lot to lay at somebody's feet at the beginning of a yoga class. Like, hey dude, I know we're just like stretching for an hour in here, but actually, did you know this is part of an ancient philosophical system of systems designed to help you grapple with the fundamental question of your existence and suffering? I'm not surprised yoga studios don't generally lead with that. The cost of not leading with that is a significant perception among people in our culture that yoga equals exercise and yoga equals fitness and stretching. And the cultural and historical artifacts that I too have largely set aside for purposes of this discussion, those are sort of attended to as an afterthought or as a kind of marketing veneer, right? Look how exotic this is. It's from far away. But I get it. I would have been put off by a class that called itself yoga and then just spent an hour discussing Patanjali's sutras. We'll get to some of those in the future, I promise. My motivation was fitness. It was a way of proving I was an intense dude. Look, I did a whole Bikram class and I didn't have to take a single break. I powered through the whole thing. Doesn't that make me a badass? It doesn't. And that mentality stuck around a lot longer than it should have. But it was there. And that was my introduction to yoga. That motivation, perhaps not the purest or most enlightened of reasons to do something, got my butt through the door. But once I tipped into the rabbit hole, over time I did come to see the practice of yoga as something much more than fitness. Right? A path appeared before me that suggested this might actually benefit my life in some way beyond just physical fitness. I would notice that my orientation and attitudes towards circumstances in my life when I was disciplined with my practice were stiller and more intentional. It began to click for me that this was not just a way to get my body right, but to get my mind right. Of course, in order to get your mind right, you have to begin with the possibility that your mind is not currently right. And why might that be the case? And then we're back to all those freaking boxes, right? And one of those boxes is labeled mental health, oy vey. That's one of the big divisions we find in our culture. And I'm not suggesting it's a bad line to draw, but one of the first divisions that we make is between our mind and our body. And some people call that mind-body dualism. A holistic practice would encourage you to view the mind and body as interconnected and dependent on one another in some inseparable way, and therefore properly understood as a totality. The holistic practice emphasizes the box that has both physical health and mental health inside of it simultaneously. But fair is fair, it's two boxes inside, right? Dualism says you can take those two things and you can understand them separately quite well, and you can inquire into them separately and dive down deep into one or the other. Even if I believe my mind and my body are one thing on some higher level, I can still separate them. I'd say right now I want to understand my mind. And what does that mean? Well, there's a lot to unpack in there before we even begin to think about physical factors. I've covered a lot, and it's time to wrap this up, but allow me to try and preview where this is going and how martial arts starts to creep into all of this discussion of systems and frameworks and the connection between these things, at least from my point of view. Because God forbid you start picking teams on these questions of how to get your mind or your body or your spirit in the right. God forbid you decide to draw a line somewhere where somebody else doesn't want it. What system are you using to pack and unpack these boxes? What system of systems do you believe is the most complete or effective? I have a hunch that whatever you pick, you will find yourself running into conflicts with other people who have picked different systems of systems. There is an unfortunate tendency towards competition. Sometimes that is healthy and productive and fosters creativity and growth and is a dynamic engine. Sometimes it's very unhealthy and destructive, and it breeds resentment and totalitarianism. Because as we construct our system, we can get a little imperial sometimes, can't we? It's like the thing inside of the box is growing and threatening to fill up the bigger box it's inside of. This is not supposed to be political, but I think we've all observed in our lives times when people have allowed their adherence to a specific system to become a kind of stand-in for their entire worldview. And the box that they stepped inside of initially to understand maybe a discrete problem began to fill and fill and fill, and then it spilled out of that box and it swallowed up another and another and another. I believe that there are warnings against this type of dogmatism in the practice of yoga. I believe one of the reasons why the practice of yoga is beneficial is to help you avoid this sorcerer's apprentice problem of a tool coming to dominate the environment that it was supposed to serve. It's one of the reasons I like yoga. I think it's one of the few spiritual systems with a good sense of humor. It warns you not to take it too seriously, not to let it become totalitarian. But conflict is still going to occur. And whatever systems we adopt, whatever beliefs we embrace, we are all going to have these systems tested by life. Our philosophies will be criticized. Our choices will be condemned. Our mantras may be met with insults and sneers. Our very being may be attacked. To me, that is why every system of systems must include a way of thinking about conflict, and that is why the yogi is also fundamentally a martial artist. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for part 2. Stay alive. Namaste.